Virgin Mountain Man paid $1 for a fat girl with a sack on her head. What he did to her next. In a frozen frontier town, a quiet loner steps out of the shadows and lays down 1 silver coin. The crowd roars with cruel laughter, because what he bought isn't land or cattle, but a girl no one else would claim. A girl hidden beneath a burlap sack. When the sack is torn away, firelight reveals the truth. She isn't broken, just forgotten, her eyes full of fear and hope. But saving her for $1 is only the beginning. A deputy rides up with papers, a brothel syndicate demands their prize, and whispers in the church pews threaten to brand them both with shame. Now the mountains will echo with a fight not of guns, but of faith, honor, and the courage to stand against every lie. Can one lonely man, untested in love, protect her dignity and prove that a single act of mercy can change 2 lives forever? Or will the frontier's cruel law tear them apart before spring comes? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. The winter wind whistled through the empty streets of Copper Creek as Matthew guided his mule along the snowy trail. Behind him, the girl sat perfectly still, the rough burlap sack still covering her face and shoulders. Her hands clutched the saddle horn, knuckles white with cold and fear. Matthew's throat felt tight. He'd never spoken much to women, let alone one under his protection. The jeers of the crowd still rang in his ears, their cruel laughter when he'd placed that single silver dollar on the auctioneer's platform. But he couldn't have walked away, not after seeing her father drag her up those wooden steps like a sack of grain. The snow fell harder now, white flakes catching in his beard and coating his wool coat. The mule's hooves crunched steadily through the fresh powder. Behind them, the sounds of the mining town grew fainter, the tinny piano from the saloon, the shouts of drunken men, the constant thud of stamp mills crushing ore. "Miss," Matthew said softly, keeping his eyes on the trail ahead, "I know you're scared, but I give you my word, no harm will come to you while you're in my care." His voice wavered slightly on the last words. He'd lived alone in his cabin for so many years, the sound of his own speech felt foreign. The girl made no response, but he noticed her shoulders trembling. Whether from cold or fear, he couldn't tell. The temperature was dropping fast as evening approached. They needed to reach his cabin before full dark. "My place is about 4 miles ahead, up in the timber," he continued, trying to sound reassuring. "It's not much, but it's warm and dry. There's plenty of firewood stacked by the hearth." Still no answer. Matthew fell silent, focusing on guiding the mule around icy patches where the trail curved upward into the pines. The snow was falling thick enough now to mask their tracks behind them. Good. He didn't trust those brothel men who'd been lurking at the edges of the crowd, especially the tall one with the fancy vest who'd been whispering with the girl's father before the auction began. After another half-mile, Matthew heard a small sound from behind him, something between a sob and a hiccup. He turned slightly in his saddle. "Would you like to take that sack off, miss? Can't be easy to breathe under there." Her hands tightened on the saddle horn. My father said I mustn't, said my face would shame any man who looked upon it." Her voice was barely a whisper, muffled by the burlap. Matthew's jaw clenched at the cruelty of it. "Your father ain't here now. And I reckon any man worth his salt knows true shame comes from the evil in his own heart, not the face God gave another." For a long moment, only the creak of saddle leather and the mule's steady breathing broke the silence. Then slowly, hesitantly, the girl's hands moved to the edges of the sack. She lifted it away, revealing a round face reddened by cold and tears. Her eyes were deep brown, filled with a wariness that made Matthew's chest ache. "I'm Isabel," she said softly. "Isabel Carter." "Matthew Brant," he replied with a slight nod. "Pleased to make your proper acquaintance, Miss Isabel." She looked down at her hands, still clutching the burlap. "Why did you do it, Mr. Brant?" "By me, I mean. Those other men, they all just laughed." Matthew guided the mule around a fallen log before answering. "My mama raised me to believe every soul has worth in the Lord's eyes. When I saw how they were treating you," he paused, searching for the right words, "well, I couldn't just stand by." wouldn't have been right. But surely you want, Isabel's voice trailed off, her face flushing deeper red. That is, most men would expect? I expect nothing from you except to treat you with the respect due any child of God, Matthew said firmly. My cabin has 2 rooms. The smaller one will be yours, with a door that locks from the inside. You'll be safe there. Isabel's eyes widened slightly. For the first time, something like hope flickered across her features. Thank you, she whispered. They rode on in silence as the forest grew darker around them. The snow continued to fall, but the worst of the wind was blocked by the thick stands of pine and fir. Matthew kept alert for any sound of pursuit, but heard only the occasional cry of a winter bird or the soft thump of snow falling from laden branches. After another mile, Isabel spoke again. Mr. Brandt, may I ask, do you live alone up here? Yes, I'm just me and my mule these past 8 years. I do some trapping, cut firewood to sell in town when needed. Keep mostly to myself. He didn't mention the loneliness that sometimes pressed in on winter nights, or his mama's last letter urging him to find a good woman and build a proper Christian home. I can cook, Isabel offered hesitantly. And so, Father always said I was worthless, but I do know how to keep a house. Matthew's hands tightened on the reins. You ain't worthless, Miss Isabel. Don't ever let anyone tell you different. He paused, then added gruffly, though I won't turn down an offer of proper cooking. Been living on salt pork and beans too long, I reckon. That earned him the smallest ghost of a smile, just a slight lifting at the corners of her mouth. But it was something. The trail grew steeper as they climbed, winding between massive old-growth pines. Fresh snow creaked under the mule's hooves. Matthew could see his cabin now through the trees, a solid structure of hand-hewn logs with a stone chimney. No smoke rose from it yet, but soon enough he'd have a fire blazing. Almost there, he said encouragingly. Just up this last rise. Isabel nodded, pulling her thin shawl tighter. Matthew made a mental note to find her something warmer to wear. He had his mama's old trunk stored away. Might be some clothes in there that could be altered. As they approached the cabin, Matthew kept his ears trained for any unusual sounds, but there was only the peaceful settling of snow and the familiar creaks of winter forest. Still, he didn't fully relax until they reached the cleared area around the cabin. No tracks in the fresh snow except those of deer and rabbit. No one had followed them. He helped Isabel down from the mule, noting how she tried to hide her stiffness from the long ride. Leading them both to the cabin door, he fumbled with his key ring. It ain't much, he said apologetically as he pushed the door open, but it's solid built. Keeps out the cold. Isabel stepped inside, looking around with wide eyes at the simple furnishings, the plank table and chairs, the iron cook stove, the shelf of books below the window. Everything was plain, but meticulously clean. Matthew busied himself with lighting the lamp and starting a fire in the hearth. Your room's through there, he said, nodding toward a door on the right. Got its own window and a proper bed. Lock works good and strong. Isabel moved toward the door, then paused. Mr. Brandt, I know you paid for me, but, I belong to you now, don't I? Matthew straightened from the hearth, meeting her anxious gaze. No, Miss Isabel. You don't belong to any man. That $1 I paid, that was to get you away from there, nothing more. You're free to stay or go as you choose. Tears welled in her eyes. I have nowhere else to go, she whispered. Then stay, Matthew said simply. Stay, as long as you like. No strings attached, no expectations. Just a safe place to rest and heal. Isabel nodded, wiping her eyes with the edge of her shawl. Thank you, she said again, and disappeared into the small room. The lock clicked softly behind her. Matthew stood for a long moment staring at the closed door. Then he turned back to building up the fire, trying not to think about the brothel men who'd been watching the auction. Something in their eyes told him this wasn't over. But for tonight at least, Isabel was safe. Tomorrow would bring what it brought. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering their tracks, muffling all sound except the crack and pop of burning logs in the hearth. Matthew settled into his chair, Mama's old Bible in his lap, and began his evening prayers, asking for guidance, for wisdom, and for the strength to protect this wounded soul who'd been placed in his care. The forest path wound ever upward, snow crunching beneath Matthew's boots as he led the mule through deepening drifts. He'd chosen to walk rather than ride, keeping one hand on the bridle and watching carefully for any sign the animal might stumble. The girl, Isabel, he reminded himself, swayed slightly in the saddle, shivering despite the threadbare shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders. Shadows lengthened between the towering pines as afternoon faded toward evening. The snowfall had eased to lazy flurries, but the temperature was dropping fast. Matthew could see his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. The mule's flanks steamed with exertion from the climb. "Not much further now," he said softly, more to break the heavy silence than anything else. Isabel made no response from beneath the burlap sack that still covered her face, but he noticed her shoulders hunch slightly at the sound of his voice. The trail curved sharply around a granite outcropping, and Matthew's cabin came into view. It stood in a small clearing, backed by a steep rise of mountain slope. Solid logs chinked with clay rose to meet a pitched roof, now wearing a thick blanket of snow. The stone chimney waited cold and dark against the pewter sky, but orange light from the setting sun caught the cabin's western windows, making them glow like embers. Matthew led the mule right up to the cabin's door, then helped Isabel down from the saddle. She was unsteady on her feet after the long ride, and he had to catch her elbow to keep her from stumbling. The moment she was balanced, he let go and stepped back, giving her space. "Let me get you inside where it's warm," he said, fumbling with the iron key. The lock turned with a familiar grinding sound, and he pushed the heavy door open. "Watch your step over the threshold." He guided her inside with gentle words, then hurried to lay a fire in the stone hearth. His fingers moved quickly, arranging kindling and striking flint to steel until flames began to lick at the dry pine shavings. Soon, the fire caught properly, casting flickering light through the cabin's single room. "Sit here by the warmth," Matthew said, pulling his mother's old rocking chair closer to the hearth. "I'll fetch some supper." He moved around the cabin with practiced efficiency, despite his awareness of Isabel's silent presence. A pot of yesterday's venison stew went on the cookstove to heat. He sliced thick pieces from a loaf of cornbread, setting them on his best tin plate, the one without dents. When the stew was bubbling, he filled 2 bowls and carried them to where Isabel sat rigid in the rocker, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The sack still covered her face, though it had slipped slightly askew during their journey. Matthew set the food on the small table beside her, then stepped back, clearing his throat awkwardly. "Miss Isabel? That is, you can take that off now. The sack, if you want to." For a long moment she didn't move. Then slowly her hands rose to the rough burlap. She hesitated, fingers curling into the fabric. "My face," she whispered. "It would shame any decent person to look upon it." Matthew's jaw tightened at the cruelty that had planted such thoughts in her mind. "No," he said firmly. "There ain't no shame in how the good Lord made us." Another moment passed before Isabel gathered her courage. The sack came away, revealing a sturdy, strong-boned face with kind brown eyes that darted nervously around the cabin before settling somewhere near Matthew's boots. Her dark hair hung in tangles around her shoulders, uncombed but thick and healthy. Matthew looked away quickly, not wanting to make her more uncomfortable by staring. "The stew's venison," he said, focusing on ladling more into his own bowl. "Shot the deer myself last week, and the cornbread's fresh, well, fresh as of yesterday anyhow." "Thank you," Isabel murmured, picking up her spoon with trembling fingers. She took a small bite, then another larger one. "It's good." They ate in silence, broken only by the crack and pop of burning logs and the occasional scrape of spoons against bowls. Matthew kept his eyes on his food, though he was acutely aware of Isabel stealing glances at him between bites, as if trying to puzzle out his intentions. When both bowls were empty, he gathered them up and carried them to the wash basin. The familiar tasks of cleaning up gave him something to do with his hands while he searched for the right words. "Miss Isabel," he began finally, still facing the basin. "I reckon you're wondering why I bought you today." "Yes," she said softly, "though I can guess well enough what most men would want with someone like me." Matthew turned to face her, careful to keep his distance. "That ain't why. Those men at the auction, I saw the way they looked at you, like you weren't even human, just property to be used." He ran a hand through his hair in frustration. "It wasn't right. Wasn't Christian. I couldn't let them." He trailed off, the words tangling in his throat. How could he explain the sick feeling in his gut when he'd seen her father drag her to that platform? The rage that had filled him at the leering faces in the crowd. "So you bought me out of Christian charity," Isabel said, a bitter edge to her voice. "To save my soul?" "No," Matthew said quickly. "That is, not exactly. He took a deep breath. "I wanted to give you a choice. Those men, they wouldn't have. But here, you're free to go or stay, as you please. Though I hope you'll stay at least until spring when the pass is clear." Isabel's eyes widened slightly. "You truly mean that? I'm free?" Matthew nodded. "That $1 I paid, it wasn't to own you, it was to keep others from doing so." She looked down at her hands twisting in her lap. "I have nowhere else to go," she whispered. "Father made it clear I'm not welcome back." "Then stay," Matthew said simply. "The cabin's warm and there's plenty of food. I'll sleep on the bench here by the fire, and you can have the bed." "The bench?" Isabel glanced at the narrow wooden seat with concern. "But it's your bed." Matthew was already pulling his mother's old quilt from the chest by the wall. "I've slept in worse places, believe me. Had to spend 3 nights in a tree once when a grizzly took a dislike to me." He attempted a smile, hoping to ease some of the tension. It worked, just barely. The corners of Isabel's mouth twitched upward for a fraction of a second. Outside, the snow was falling heavily now. Wind whistled around the cabin's eaves, but inside, the fire had warmed the single room thoroughly. Matthew spread the quilt on his bed, then added an extra blanket for good measure. "There's a wash basin behind that screen in the corner," he said, pointing, "and spare candles in the box by the window if you need them. He gestured vaguely toward the bench. Isabel stood, smoothing her skirts with shaking hands. "Thank you, Mr. Brandt." "For everything." Matthew nodded awkwardly. "Sleep well, Miss Isabel." He settled himself on the hard bench using his rolled-up coat as a pillow. The fire had died down to glowing coals, casting soft shadows on the walls. He could hear Isabel moving quietly around the bed, the rustle of blankets as she lay down. Snow continued to fall outside, deepening the drifts that already covered their tracks from town. Matthew stared at the fading embers, his mind turning over the day's events. The auction, the desperate ride through the forest, the girl now lying in his bed, still fearful but perhaps a little less so than before. He shifted on the uncomfortable bench, trying to find a position that didn't make his back ache. It would be a long night, but he'd meant what he said. He'd slept in worse places. And tomorrow, well, tomorrow would bring what it brought. Gray light filtered through the cabin's frosted windows as Isabel stirred beneath the heavy quilts. The rhythmic thunk of an axe splitting wood carried through the walls, accompanied by the soft whisper of falling snow. She lay still for a moment, taking in the unfamiliar surroundings. The neat stack of Matthew's books beside the bed, his mother's Bible prominent among them, the faint scent of pine smoke from the banked fire. The chopping continued outside, steady and strong. Isabel slipped from beneath the warm covers, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders. Her feet found the smooth wooden floorboards, worn from years of Matthew's footsteps. The cabin felt different in the pale morning light, smaller but somehow less threatening than it had appeared the night before. She moved quietly to the cook stove, lifting the heavy iron lid to check the embers. Still hot. Isabel glanced toward the cupboard, then back at the door. Matthew had said she was free to go, but he'd also said she could stay. And after years of cooking for her father's harsh criticism, perhaps she could show her gratitude in this small way. The cupboard revealed simple but adequate provisions: cornmeal, dried beans, salted pork, and to her surprise, fresh eggs nestled in straw. She found a well-seasoned skillet and set to work with practiced hands. The cabin door creaked open just as she was laying out 2 plates on the rough-hewn table. Matthew stepped inside, bringing a blast of cold air and an armload of split wood. Snow dusted his broad shoulders and dark hair. He stopped short at the sight of her by the stove, surprise clear on his weathered face. "You didn't have to cook," he said, carefully setting the wood in the box by the hearth. "I would have managed. I wanted to," Isabel replied softly, keeping her eyes on the task of dividing the cornbread and eggs between their plates. "It's the least I can do after yesterday." Matthew shuffled his feet, brushing snow from his coat. Much obliged, then. It smells mighty fine. They sat across from each other at the small table, steam rising from their plates. Isabel watched as Matthew bowed his head briefly, lips moving in a silent grace that seemed both habitual and somehow unpracticed, as if he were remembering something long forgotten. "My name is Isabel," she said suddenly, breaking the quiet. "Isabel Carter. I should have told you before." Matthew nodded, careful to keep his eyes on his plate. "It's a pretty name. Suits you better than what they called you at that auction." Isabel's hands tightened around her fork. "My father, he'd arranged to sell me to some men from a brothel syndicate up north." The words came out in a rush, as if speaking them quickly would make them less painful. "Said I was too much trouble to feed, too plain to find a proper husband. When they couldn't agree on a price, he decided to auction me off instead." Matthew's jaw clenched, but his voice remained gentle. "You don't have to talk about it if you don't want to." "No, I need to explain." Isabel took a shaky breath. "I can't stay here. You've been kind, kinder than anyone since my mother died, but I won't be a burden. As soon as the snow lets up, I'll go." "Where?" Matthew asked simply. The question hung in the air between them. Isabel stared down at her half-eaten breakfast, fighting back tears. "I don't know," she whispered. "But I can't keep imposing on your charity." "It ain't charity," Matthew said firmly, "and you ain't imposing." He pushed back from the table, clearly uncomfortable with the intensity of the moment. "Come on, I want to show you something." He led her to the barn, a solid structure attached to the main cabin by a covered walkway. Inside, warm animal smells replaced the sharp winter air. A brown mule lifted its head from a hay-filled manger, ears pricking forward with interest. "This here's Bessie," Matthew said, reaching out to scratch the mule's forehead. "Best pack animal I've ever had. And over there's Nanny." He gestured to a white goat dozing in a corner stall. "She gives enough milk for cheese and butter most days." Isabel stepped closer to Bessie, who snuffled her sleeve hopefully. "They're well cared for," she observed, noting the clean stalls and fresh bedding. "Have to be," Matthew replied, moving to check Nanny's water bucket. "Can't survive up here without good animals. I make my living trapping in winter, cutting wood in summer. Bessie helps haul it all to town when the weather allows." He paused, checking the goat's feed. "It ain't much, but it's honest work. Keeps food on the table and a roof overhead." Isabel understood what he wasn't saying, that there was room here for another person, that his life might be simple, but it was built on decency and hard work. She watched as he moved through the familiar tasks of caring for his animals, his big hand surprisingly gentle as he checked Nanny's hooves for ice buildup. "Why do you live all alone up here?" she asked softly. Matthew was quiet for a long moment, straightening up from his task. "Easier, I reckon. Townfolk. They don't much understand someone who prefers quiet. And after Ma passed," he shrugged, the gesture somehow containing years of solitude. "Just seemed better to keep to myself." They returned to the cabin as evening approached, the short winter day already fading. Matthew knelt by the hearth to mend a broken snowshoe, his broad fingers working carefully with strips of rawhide. Before starting, he bowed his head awkwardly, lips moving in what might have been a prayer. Isabel, watching from her seat by the fire, recognized the gesture from breakfast, that same mixture of ingrained habit and rusty faith. The stew she'd prepared bubbled gently on the cook stove, filling the cabin with savory smells. Outside, snow continued to fall, but inside was warm and peaceful. Matthew worked steadily at his task while Isabel darned a hole in one of his worn socks she'd found in the mending basket. When they sat down to eat, the silence between them felt different than it had that morning, less strained, more companionable. Still, Isabel was acutely aware of her small bundle of belongings, hidden beneath her pillow on Matthew's bed. The urge to run to avoid being a burden remained strong despite his kindness. Matthew seemed to sense her unease. "Miss Isabel," he said carefully, setting down his spoon. "I meant what I said yesterday. You're welcome to stay as long as you wish. No obligations, no expectations. Just me," he gestured around the cabin. encompassing its simple comforts. A safe place to rest and decide what you want for yourself. Isabel nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. In all her life, no one had ever offered her the simple dignity of choice. She turned back to her stew, but her hand trembled less as she lifted the spoon. The evening deepened around them, snow piling against the windows in soft drifts. Matthew returned to his bench by the fire, working on the snowshoe by lamplight. Isabel sat in the rocking chair, one of his mother's old quilts across her lap, watching the flames dance in the hearth. Neither spoke, but the silence held comfort rather than fear. Later, as she lay in bed listening to Matthew's quiet breathing from his makeshift bed by the fire, Isabel's hand crept beneath her pillow to touch her bundled belongings. The familiar motion brought less panic than it had the night before. Perhaps, she thought as sleep began to overtake her, perhaps she could stay, just for a little while, just until she found her feet. 2 days passed like gentle winter snowfall at Matthew's mountain cabin. The rhythms of simple life began to take hold. Morning light would find Isabel at the cook stove, preparing breakfast while Matthew tended the animals. During the days, she discovered torn shirts and worn socks in need of mending, keeping her hands busy while Matthew split logs outside. The steady thunk of his axe became a comforting heartbeat to her days. The cabin felt different now, less like a temporary shelter and more like something that could, with time, become familiar. Isabel found herself studying the rough-hewn walls, noting places where a woman's touch might soften the bachelor's starkness, a patch of sunlight that would be perfect for herb drying, a corner where a quilt might brighten the room. Matthew seemed to move more easily in his own space too, though he still kept a careful distance. His shoulders weren't quite so tense when they shared meals, and sometimes she caught him watching her with a puzzled expression, as if he couldn't quite believe she was real. On the evening of the second day, Isabel stirred a pot of bean soup, while Matthew cleaned his hunting knife at the table. The cabin smelled of cornbread and wood smoke, peaceful in the gathering dusk. Snow had been falling steadily since morning, adding to the sense of isolation that wrapped around them like a protective blanket. The sudden sound of horses' hooves crunching through snow shattered their quiet routine. Matthew's head snapped up, his whole body going still as he listened. Isabel's hands froze on the soup ladle, her heart beginning to race. "Stay inside," Matthew said quietly, rising from the table. He moved to the door, his stockinged feet silent on the wooden floor. The sound of voices carried through the walls, men's voices sharp with authority. Isabel crept to the window, peering through frosted glass. 3 riders sat their horses in the yard, snow dusting their shoulders. The lead rider wore a deputy's badge that caught the last light of day. Matthew opened the door, filling the frame with his broad shoulders. "Evening, deputy," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "Long ride up from town in this weather." "Mr. Brandt." The deputy's voice was thin and cold as the winter air. Isabel recognized him now. Deputy Harlan Boone, known for taking bribes from the saloon owners and brothel keepers. "Got some papers here need discussing." 2 men flanked the deputy, one lean and sharp-featured, the other thick-necked and mean-eyed. They weren't lawmen. Isabel could tell by their clothes and the way they sat their horses. Her stomach clenched as she recognized them. Pike and Dugan, men who worked for the brothel syndicate up north. "Whatever business you have, we can discuss it out here," Matthew said firmly. Deputy Boone pulled a folded document from his coat. "Got here a complaint of unlawful trafficking," he drawled. "Seems you purchased a young woman under questionable circumstances 2 days past. That transaction weren't properly witnessed or recorded." "I prevented a grave injustice," Matthew replied. "Nothing questionable about it." Pike, the lean one, spat into the snow. "That girl was promised elsewhere, mountain man. We had first claim." "A human being ain't property to be claimed," Matthew's voice held steel now. "Law says different," Dugan growled. "We got papers showing her daddy promised her service to our establishment up north. You interfered with a legal contract." Isabel's hands began to shake. She pressed them against the rough wood of the window frame, trying to steady herself. These men had come to take her back to the shame and horror her father had planned for her. "The girl stays here," Matthew said, "under my protection." Deputy Boone's face hardened. "That ain't your choice to make, Brandt. Either you turn her over peaceful-like, or I'll have to arrest you for obstruction and trafficking. Then she goes back anyway. Isabel couldn't bear it any longer. She rushed to the door, pushing past Matthew to stand in the doorway. "Please," she begged, "don't make me go with them. They mean to sell me to a brothel." Matthew's arm came around her shoulders, steady and strong. "No one's taking you anywhere against your will, Miss Isabel." "Not while I draw breath." The deputy's eyes narrowed. "Best mind how you talk, Brandt. Law don't look kindly on men who steal other men's property." "She ain't property." Matthew's voice rose for the first time since Isabel had known him. "She's a child of God, same as any of us. And she stays under my roof until he says different." Pike and Dugan exchanged dark looks, their hands drifting toward their gun belts. Deputy Boone raised a hand, stopping them. After a long moment, he folded the papers back into his coat. "Have it your way for now," he said coldly. "But there'll be a hearing when the circuit judge comes through next month. Till then, you keep her here where we can find her. Try to run, and I'll have every lawman in the territory hunting you both." Matthew's arm tightened protectively around Isabel's shoulders. "We ain't going nowhere. Truth will stand at any hearing." "We'll see about that." The deputy gathered his reins. "Pike, Dugan, we're riding back. Mr. Brandt here has bought himself some time to reconsider his position." The two men glared but turned their horses to follow the deputy. Pike called back over his shoulder, "Enjoy playing house with your mountain man, girl. Won't last long." Isabel watched them ride away through the falling snow, their dark shapes disappearing into the gathering night. Only when they were completely gone did she realize she was trembling violently. Her legs gave way and she would have fallen if not for Matthew's support. "Come inside," he said gently. "You're freezing." He led her to his chair by the fire, wrapping one of his mother's old quilts around her shoulders. Isabel buried her face in her hands and began to weep. Great, racking sobs that shook her whole body. All the fear and shame of the past days poured out of her. "They'll take me back," she choked out between sobs. "They'll make me go with those awful men." "No." Matthew knelt beside her chair, his rough hands covering hers with surprising gentleness. "Listen to me, Miss Isabel. What I said out there wasn't just words. You belong here, safe under this roof, for as long as you choose to stay. I won't let any man force you back to that life your father planned." Isabel raised her tear-stained face, "But the deputy said—" "Deputy Boone's in the pocket of them brothel men," Matthew said grimly. "But even he has to follow proper law. We'll speak truth at that hearing. Show the judge what kind of men Pike and Dugan really are. Truth and right will win out in the end." "How can you be so sure?" Matthew was quiet for a moment, his eyes on the fire. "My ma used to say that God don't sleep through injustice. He works through human hands, using ordinary folks to set things right." He gave a small, self-deprecating smile. "Reckon maybe that's why he had me in town that day with that silver dollar in my pocket." Isabel wiped her eyes with the corner of the quilt. "I've been so afraid," she whispered. "Afraid to trust this piece. Afraid it would all be snatched away." "I know." Matthew stood and moved to put another log on the fire. "But you ain't alone anymore. Whatever comes, we'll face it together." The soup had burned during the confrontation, but neither of them felt much like eating anyway. Isabel sat in the chair by the fire while Matthew moved quietly around the cabin, securing doors and windows for the night. When he finally settled on his makeshift bed near the hearth, she could see the weight of worry in the set of his shoulders. "Thank you," she said softly, "for standing up to them, for offering me a real choice." Matthew nodded, his eyes on the dancing flames. "Get some rest, Miss Isabel. Tomorrow's another day." But long after Isabel had climbed into bed, she could see Matthew still sitting by the fire. His Bible lay open in his lap, though she wasn't sure he was reading it. His big hands were clasped together, and his lips moved silently in what might have been prayer. The responsibility he'd taken on, protecting her, defying the law, facing powerful enemies. It was more than anyone had ever done for her. Snow fell steadily outside, banking against the windows and muffling all sound from the world beyond. Inside the cabin, the fire crackled softly, and Matthew kept his vigil. Isabel drifted off to sleep watching him, feeling for the first time in her life truly safe and protected. Dawn broke cold and clear over the mountain cabin. Matthew stood at the window, watching the sun paint the snow-covered branches in shades of rose and gold. His mind was made up. After yesterday's confrontation, hiding Isabel away would only feed the rumors and suspicions in town. He turned from the window to find Isabel already awake, stirring a pot of morning porridge over the fire. "Miss Isabel," he said, clearing his throat. "I've been thinking. Would you care to attend church service with me today?" Isabel's spoon froze mid-stir. "Church?" her voice quavered. "In town?" "Yes'm, reckon it's time folks see you proper like, not skulking in shadows." Matthew shifted his weight, uncertain. "That is, if you're willing." Isabel stared into the porridge pot for a long moment. "They'll whisper about me," she said softly. "About us." "Let 'em whisper." Matthew's voice grew firm. "You got nothing to be ashamed of, and church is where you belong on Sunday, same as any God-fearing person." After breakfast, they prepared for the journey. Matthew helped Isabel wrap herself in his spare wool coat and an old scarf. He harnessed the mule to his small sledge. Walking would be too difficult in the deep snow. The winter morning was bitter as they set out. Their breath frosted in the air, and the sledge runners creaked against the packed snow. Matthew walked alongside, leading the mule, while Isabel perched on the wooden seat wrapped in quilts. The forest was silent around them except for the occasional crack of a snow-laden branch. "It's beautiful," Isabel murmured, gazing at the ice crystal trees sparkling in the sun. "Like God decorated everything in diamonds." Matthew glanced at her, surprised by the poetry in her words. Reckon he did at that. The journey took nearly 3 hours, following the winding trail down from the mountain. As they approached town, Isabel's shoulders tensed. Matthew could see her drawing in on herself, chin tucking down. The little wooden church sat on the edge of town, its bell tower reaching toward the crisp blue sky. A handful of townspeople were already filing in as Matthew helped Isabel down from the sledge. He could hear the whispers starting, see the pointing fingers. Shame bringing her here. That mountain man's got nerve. Poor Reverend Turner must be rolling in his grave. Matthew placed a gentle hand on Isabel's back, guiding her up the church steps. Inside, the pot-bellied stove radiated welcome warmth. They found seats near the back, though in the small space there was no real hiding. More people filed in, some openly staring, others pointedly looking away. Mrs. Abigail Turner, the preacher's widow, sat at the wheezy pump organ. Her eyes met Isabel's with unexpected kindness before she began the opening hymn. The familiar notes of Amazing Grace filled the little church. Isabel sat silent at first, then Matthew heard her voice join in, barely a whisper. But as the verses continued, her voice grew stronger, pure, and clear as a mountain stream. One by one, other voices fell silent until Isabel's song soared alone, filling every corner of the church with its sweet clarity. Matthew saw tears in Mrs. Turner's eyes as she played the final verse. When the hymn ended, the silence held for a long moment before Mrs. Turner started the next song. Isabel sang them all, her voice growing more confident with each one. Matthew noticed some of the harder faces in the congregation beginning to soften. After the service, Isabel lingered near the stove while Matthew exchanged stiff nods with some of the men. He kept her in his sight, watching as Mrs. Turner approached her. "You have a beautiful voice, my dear," the widow said, loud enough for others to hear. She unwrapped her own wool shawl and draped it around Isabel's shoulders. "Such a gift belongs in God's house. You must come sing with us every Sunday." Isabel's fingers clutched the soft wool. "Thank you, ma'am," she whispered. "But I wouldn't want to cause trouble." "Nonsense," Mrs. Turner's voice was firm. "The Lord's house is open to all his children. Those who would say different need to examine their own hearts." Matthew saw several women shift uncomfortably at this rebuke. "Good. Let them wrestle with their consciences." The ride home was quieter, both of them lost in thought. The afternoon sun cast long blue shadows across the snow. Isabel kept touching Mrs. Turner's shawl, as if she couldn't quite believe in its reality. "Thank you," she said suddenly, breaking the silence, "for taking me today. For not hiding me away like something shameful." Matthew felt his face grow warm and not from the cold. "Ain't right to hide what's good and true," he mumbled. "I was so scared," Isabel admitted. "But when I started singing, it felt like coming home. like God was listening, not judging. He was, Matthew said simply, and he always will be. They reached the cabin as evening was drawing in. Matthew tended to the mule while Isabel got a fire going inside. When he entered, stamping snow from his boots, she was humming one of the hymns softly to herself. "Would you?" Matthew hesitated. "Would you sing it proper if you've a mind to, that is?" Isabel smiled, the first real smile he'd seen from her. As she sang Rock of Ages, her voice filling the cabin with its pure notes, Matthew felt something shift in his heart. This wasn't just about protecting her anymore. It was about helping her find her place in the world, a place where she could shine as God intended. The last notes faded into the gathering dusk. Isabel's cheeks were pink, but her eyes shone with joy. Matthew busied himself with the fire, overcome by emotions he couldn't name. The shawl. Isabel touched it again, wonderingly. Mrs. Turner didn't have to do that. Didn't have to welcome me. No, Matthew agreed. She chose to. Same as we all choose. To show kindness or turn away. He paused, adding another log to the fire. Reckon that's what makes it matter so much. Outside, the wind picked up, driving snow against the windows, but inside the cabin was warm and peaceful. Isabel began preparing their evening meal, still humming softly. Matthew watched her move about the cabin, no longer hunched in shame, but standing straighter, as if the day's events had given her new strength. The memory of her voice rising in church stayed with him, clear and true despite the whispers, despite the scowls. Like the first spring flower pushing through snow, he thought. Beautiful, not in spite of the harsh conditions, but somehow because of them. Isabel caught him watching and blushed. "I know it ain't proper me being here," she said softly. "But today felt right, like maybe there's hope for me yet." "There's always hope," Matthew said firmly, "especially for them that keep faith in dark times." He didn't add what he was thinking, that her courage in facing the town had given him hope too. Hope that goodness could triumph over cruelty, that light could overcome shadow. One gentle widow's kindness, one pure voice, raised in praise. Sometimes that was all it took to start changing hearts. Evening settled over the mountain as Matthew and Isabel worked to prepare for the approaching storm. Dark clouds massed on the horizon, promising heavy snow. The wind already carried an extra bite, whistling through the bare branches. "Reckon we ought to get more wood stacked inside," Matthew said, eyeing the threatening sky. "Storm like that could last days." Isabel nodded, pulling her shawl, Mrs. Turner's gift, tighter around her shoulders. "I'll help. Better than sitting idle while you do all the work." Together, they formed a chain, Matthew carrying armloads of split logs from the woodpile while Isabel stacked them neatly along the cabin's inner wall. The physical labor warmed them despite the falling temperature. Isabel found herself admiring Matthew's quiet strength as he worked, the way he moved with careful purpose, never wasting motion. "The storage chest might hold more kindling," Matthew suggested, stamping snow from his boots. "If you wouldn't mind looking through it." The chest sat in the corner, its wood worn smooth by years of use. Isabel knelt beside it, lifting the heavy lid. Inside, she found an orderly collection of supplies, twine, fishing hooks, spare axe handles. But beneath a folded quilt, her fingers touched something different, a bundle of papers tied with faded blue ribbon. She drew back, not wanting to pry, but curiosity tugged at her. The papers were clearly old, handled often enough that the edges had softened. "Matthew," she called softly, "I found some letters here. Should I move them somewhere else?" Matthew turned from stacking wood and a flush crept up his neck when he saw what she held. "Oh, they're from my mother, before she passed on." "I'm sorry," Isabel said quickly. "I didn't mean to intrude." "No, Matthew ran a hand through his hair, looking flustered. "It's all right. Been meaning to tell you about them anyway." He crossed to the chest and gently took the bundle, turning it over in his large hands. The wind rattled the shutters, making the lamplight flicker. "Ma wrote these her last year when the consumption was taking her," he said quietly. "One letter for each month, telling me all the things she wanted to make sure I knew. How to keep house proper, which herbs heal what ailments. But mostly, He cleared his throat. Mostly urging me to find a wife. Build a Christian home like she and Pa had. Isabel's heart softened at the way his voice roughened. She wanted you to have a family. Yes'm. Matthew sank onto the bench, still holding the letters. She knew I was different. Quiet-like. Never comfortable around folks, especially women. Said that didn't matter, though. Said the right woman would see past all that. And did you look, Isabel asked gently, for this right woman? Matthew's laugh held no humor. How could I? Look at me. Big, awkward fellow who'd rather talk to trees than people, living alone up here like some hermit. What woman would want that? The pain in his voice struck deep. Isabel knew that feeling, of being unwanted, different, too much or too little for anyone to love. She moved to sit beside him on the bench. Your mother saw more in you, she said softly. She must have known what a good man you'd become. Matthew stared at the letters, his thumb tracing the ribbon. She had faith, I'll give her that. More than I ever did. He glanced at Isabel, then quickly away. Reckon that's why I keep reading these, even after 10 years. Reminds me she believed better things for me even when I couldn't. The wind howled outside, throwing snow against the windows. Isabel shivered, and Matthew rose to add more wood to the fire. The flames leaped higher, filling the cabin with warmth and dancing light. My mother died when I was young, Isabel said suddenly. But I remember she used to sing while she worked. Hymns mostly, but sometimes old love songs too. She'd tell me stories about meeting my father, how he courted her with wild flowers and sweet words. What happened, Matthew asked, settling back on the bench. To change him so? Isabel wrapped her arms around herself. The drought came. 3 bad years in a row. The farm failed, and something in Pa just broke. He started drinking, gambling. The sweet man Mama married disappeared. After she died, he barely looked at me except to say how much I cost to feed. Matthew's hand twitched as if he wanted to reach for her but held back. That ain't right. A father should protect his children, not... He trailed off, jaw tightening. I used to hide in the barn and sing Mama's songs, Isabel continued. Pretend she was still there, brushing my hair and telling me I was beautiful, no matter what Pa said. She touched her face self-consciously. Silly, I know. It ain't silly at all, Matthew said firmly. Sometimes memories are all we have to hold on to. The storm's fury increased, but inside the cabin grew cozier. Matthew shared stories of winters past, the time he had to dig through 6 feet of snow to reach his trapped goat, the Christmas he spent in a cave waiting out a blizzard, the spring he found a bear had ransacked his stores. Isabel found herself laughing at his dry humor, the way he painted pictures with simple words. She told him about the cat who used to sleep in her mother's washing basket, about learning to make biscuits by feel, because they couldn't decide of us my number. Kursiber köder per semmermen de sansen detta med kaikreader. A preda rezikerki preder samam frefrper. Proper measuring cup. The evening passed in gentle conversation, punctuated by the crack of burning logs and the storm's wild voice. Isabel noticed how Matthew's shoulders gradually relaxed, how his hands stopped their nervous movement. His whole bearing softened as he spoke of his mother's garden, the flowers she coaxed from the mountain soil. She loved beauty, he said, gazing into the fire. Used to say God put it everywhere if we had eyes to see. Even in hard places, even in hard times. Like Mrs. Turner's kindness today, Isabel mused, a beautiful thing in a hard place. Matthew nodded. Exactly so. He hesitated, then added quietly, like you're singing in church. Brought light into a dark corner, it did. Isabel felt her cheeks warm at the compliment. Outside, the snow continued to fall, coating the world in pristine white. But inside Matthew's cabin, their cabin now, she realized with a start, warmth and comfort reigned. She looked at the bundle of letters still resting on the bench between them. Such a small thing to carry so much hope, so much love. A mother's dreams for her son, carefully preserved through lonely years. Would you? She paused, gathering courage. Would you read one? If you don't mind sharing. Matthew's eyes widened in surprise, but after a moment he carefully untied the ribbon. His big hands were gentle as he unfolded one of the letters, holding it close to the lamplight. "My dearest son," he read softly. "Spring is coming to the mountain again, and I find myself thinking of your future. The Lord didn't make us for solitude, Matthew. He made us to share our lives, to help carry each other's burdens." Isabel closed her eyes, letting his deep voice wash over her. In the words of a mother long gone, she heard echoes of her own mother's wisdom, her own heart's lonely yearning. The fire crackled, the wind sang, and two souls drew closer in the storm-wrapped night. Morning came softly, the storm still wrapping the cabin in swirling white. Isabel woke to find Matthew already up, his bedroll neatly folded. The fire had been stoked, and fresh water sat warming by the hearth. Through the frosted windows, the world outside was a blur of dancing snow. "Reckon we're stuck inside today," Matthew said, glancing up from where he sat at the table, tools spread before him. "Storm's got no mind to let up." Isabel stretched and moved to the fire, grateful for its warmth. "Then it's a good day for baking," she said. "I noticed you've got flour and yeast stored up. Help yourself to whatever you need." Matthew nodded, turning back to the steel trap in his hands. His fingers worked methodically, checking springs and hinges for wear. The familiar task seemed to ease his usual awkwardness. Isabel gathered her supplies, settling into a rhythm of her own. She measured flour into a bowl, added yeast and warm water, then began working the dough with practiced hands. The familiar motions brought comfort. This, at least, she knew how to do well. The morning passed in companionable quiet. Matthew's tools clinked against metal as he repaired trap after trap. Isabel's hands moved steadily, kneading and shaping the bread dough. The storm's voice rose and fell outside, but inside the cabin felt peaceful, almost domestic. "My mother taught me to bake," Isabel said softly, breaking the silence. "Said a woman should know how to make something from nothing." She smiled at the memory, though I recall making quite a mess of it at first. Matthew looked up, a half-smile tugging at his mouth. "Reckon we all start somewhere. First trap I set caught nothing but my own boot." Isabel laughed, the sound brightening the cabin. "How old were you?" 10 or so, Matthew said. "Pa wasn't pleased about the ruined boot, but he showed me proper technique after. Said failure's the best teacher, long as you learn from it." Isabel set her dough to rise, covering it with a clean cloth. Wise words. "Though I hope this bread turns out better than my first attempts." "Smells promising already," Matthew said, then ducked his head, suddenly shy again. As noon approached, the wind's fury increased. Snow piled higher against the cabin walls, and Matthew frowned at the window. "Better bring in more firewood while we still can," he said, rising from his work. "Storm might last another day yet." Isabel straightened from checking her bread. "I'll help. 4 hands are better than 2. Matthew started to protest but stopped at her determined look. Instead, he helped her bundle up in his spare coat, which hung nearly to her knees. The sight made him smile, though he tried to hide it. They stepped out into a world transformed. The snow reached past Isabel's knees, and still it fell in thick, swirling sheets. The woodpile stood as a vague, dark shape through the whiteness. Isabel took one step and promptly sank deep, losing her balance. She would have fallen if Matthew hadn't caught her arm. His grip was gentle, but sure. "Sorry," she laughed, cheeks pink from cold and embarrassment. "Deeper than I thought." "Here," Matthew said, still holding her arm, "step in my tracks. I'll break trail." They made slow progress to the woodpile, Matthew forging ahead while Isabel followed carefully in his footsteps. The wind caught her hair, throwing snow in her face until she was laughing again, the sound carrying bright and clear, despite the storm. Matthew found himself smiling too as he loaded her arms with smaller pieces of wood, taking the heavier logs himself. They made several trips, working together until the indoor wood box was full again. By the time they finished, they were both covered in snow, their breaths coming in white puffs. "Your bread's ready for baking," Matthew noted as Isabel shed his coat, her cheeks still glowing from the cold. The afternoon settled into another peaceful rhythm. The scent of baking bread filled the cabin, mingling with the sharp pine smell of the fire. Matthew finished his trap repairs and moved on to mending a pair of snowshoes while Isabel worked on darning his socks. As evening approached, they shared a simple supper of fresh bread and thick stew. Matthew couldn't help noticing how the lamplight caught in Isabel's hair, how her eyes crinkled when she smiled. But each time she looked his way, he quickly averted his gaze, studying his bowl intently. "You know," Isabel said, breaking a piece of warm bread, "it's all right to look at me. I won't break from it." Matthew's ears reddened. "I didn't mean to stare. It's just—" He fumbled for words. "Just what?" Isabel prompted gently. "Just nice. Having someone else here." He managed to meet her eyes briefly. "The cabin feels different. Warmer somehow." Isabel's smile softened. "It does, doesn't it?" She buttered another piece of bread. "You've made it feel like home to me, Matthew. I want you to know that." The simple honesty in her voice touched something deep in Matthew's heart. He nodded, not trusting himself to speak. After supper, Isabel took up her mending again, humming softly as she worked. Matthew recognized the tune. Amazing Grace. Though she sang no words, her voice was sweet and clear, filling the cabin with gentle music. He found himself pausing in his own work just to listen. The hymn brought memories of his mother, of childhood Sundays and quiet evenings much like this one. But Isabel's presence made it something new, something that eased the old ache of loneliness he'd carried so long. When darkness fell fully outside, they prepared for sleep as had become their routine. Isabel took Matthew's bed while he made his place on the bench. But tonight, before lying down, Matthew knelt beside his makeshift bed. In the dim firelight, he bowed his head. "Lord," he whispered, soft enough that Isabel might not hear, "thank you. For the storm. For fresh bread. For," he paused, swallowing hard, "for sending someone to share this place. Amen." The storm's voice gentled through the night, and by dawn it had spent itself completely. Matthew woke to absolute silence, the deep, muffled quiet that comes only after heavy snow. Sunlight streamed through the windows, reflecting blindingly off the pristine white world outside. Isabel was already up, warming breakfast by the fire. She smiled at him, and Matthew found himself smiling back without his usual self-consciousness. Somehow, in the space of a storm-bound day, something had shifted between them. The awkward awareness of being strangers had melted away like snow in sunshine, leaving behind something warm and natural as breathing. They ate breakfast together, sharing the last of yesterday's bread. Though neither spoke of the feelings growing between them, the silence was comfortable, full of unspoken understanding. The mountains outside stood pristine and white against the blue sky, as if the world had been made new in the night. The morning sun blazed bright against endless white, making Matthew squint as he adjusted the straps on 2 pairs of snowshoes. The storm had left behind nearly 3 feet of fresh powder, transforming the familiar forest into fairyland of crystalline branches and pristine drifts. "These might feel strange at first," he explained, kneeling to help Isabel secure the bindings around her boots. "But they'll keep you from sinking." Isabel wobbled as she stood, arms outstretched for balance. The wooden frames beneath her feet felt unwieldy, like having boats strapped to her legs. "I feel like a duck," she admitted with a self-conscious laugh. "You'll get used to it," Matthew assured her, shouldering his pack. "Just try walking normal-like but a bit wider stance." He demonstrated, making tracks in the untouched snow. Isabel took one tentative step, then another. On her third stride, the front of one snowshoe caught in the snow, pitching her forward with a startled yelp. Matthew turned quickly, catching her before she fell. His hands were steady on her arms, surprisingly gentle for their size. "I've got you," he said softly. Their faces were close, breath mingling in the cold air. For a moment, neither moved. Then Matthew cleared his throat and carefully set her upright again, though his hands lingered a heartbeat longer than necessary. "Thank you," Isabel said, cheeks pink from more than just the cold. She straightened her skirts, determined to master this new skill. "Show me again?" They practiced in the clearing near the cabin until Isabel found her rhythm. Soon she was following Matthew's tracks through the silent forest, marveling at how the snow draped every branch and boulder like fine lace. Their progress was slow but steady, punctuated by Isabel's occasional stumbles and resulting laughter. "Where are we headed?" she asked, pausing to catch her breath. The exercise had brought color to her face, and her eyes sparkled with adventure. "There's a grove of young pines about a mile ahead," Matthew replied. "Their boughs make good bedding, softer than straw, and they keep their scent for weeks." He glanced at her. "Thought you might like something fresh for your bed." Isabel's smile warmed him more than any fire. "That's very thoughtful." They continued on, Matthew breaking trail while Isabel followed. He pointed out rabbit tracks and deer paths, showed her how to spot the difference between hemlock and pine. Isabel drank in every detail, asking questions that revealed her quick mind and genuine interest. When they reached the grove, Matthew demonstrated how to harvest the springy boughs, cutting them at just the right angle with his knife. Isabel proved an apt student, gathering armfuls of fragrant branches while humming softly to herself. By midday, they had collected enough pine boughs to fill Matthew's pack. Finding a fallen log swept clear of snow by the wind, they sat to rest and share the simple meal Matthew had brought: dried venison, hard cheese, and strips of jerky. "Did you always want to live in the mountains?" Isabel asked, breaking the comfortable silence. Matthew considered the question, chewing thoughtfully. "Not always. As a boy, I dreamed of sailing ships, if you can believe it. Never even seen the ocean." He smiled ruefully. "But after Ma passed, the quiet up here suited me. Or maybe I just got used to being alone." "And now?" Isabel's voice was soft. Matthew met her eyes briefly before looking away. "Now, well, seems less quiet lately." Isabel pulled her shawl tighter, though she wasn't cold. "I had dreams too once. Simple ones. A home of my own, children maybe. A husband who," she paused, "who would see me as more than a burden." "You're not a burden," Matthew said firmly, surprising them both with his vehemence. "Not to me." "Never think that." Emotion flickered across Isabel's face. She reached out impulsively and squeezed his hand. Matthew's fingers curled around hers, rough and warm. The moment stretched between them, delicate as a soap bubble. Finally, Matthew cleared his throat. "We should head back before the sun gets too low." They packed up their meal and resumed their journey, taking a different route home. The afternoon light slanted golden through the trees, casting long blue shadows across the snow. When they came to a frozen creek, Isabel paused to admire how the ice had formed in graceful patterns. "Will there be flowers here come spring?" she asked, trying to imagine the sleeping life beneath all this white. Matthew nodded, pointing to various spots along the bank. Wild iris there and columbine, shooting stars on that slope, and sometimes wild roses if the season's good. He glanced at her. "I'll show you when the thaw comes, if you're still." He left the sentence unfinished. "I'd like that," Isabel said simply. Back at the cabin, Matthew helped Isabel arrange the fresh pine boughs on her bed while she insisted on preparing a special supper. She shooed him outside to finish his chores, wanting to surprise him. When Matthew returned, stamping snow from his boots, the cabin was filled with warm, savory smells. Isabel had transformed their usual simple fare into something approaching a feast. Beans slow-cooked with bacon, cornbread golden from the oven, and even apple dumplings made from dried fruit she'd found in his stores. "You didn't have to go to all this trouble," Matthew protested, though his eyes lit up at the sight. "I wanted to," Isabel said firmly, setting 2 plates on the table. "To thank you." "For what?" "For everything. For treating me like a person, not property. For giving me a safe place to land." She busied herself with serving, avoiding his eyes. "For making me feel welcome." Matthew sat down slowly, watching her move about the cabin with such natural grace. "Truth is," he said haltingly, "you've brought something to this place I didn't even know was missing." He struggled to find the right word, so it's like spring. Coming after a long winter. Everything's brighter somehow. Isabel stilled, the serving spoon hovering above his plate. Their eyes met across the table, firelight dancing in both their faces. Understanding passed between them, warm and wordless as sunlight. Neither spoke for a long moment, letting the truth of it settle in their hearts. Finally, Isabel smiled and finished serving their meal. They ate together in comfortable silence, sharing occasional glances that held more meaning than words could express. Outside, stars began pricking through the darkening sky, while inside the cabin glowed with warmth and something that felt remarkably like hope. The cabin had settled into a comfortable routine over the past days. That evening, Matthew sat mending a broken trap by the hearth while Isabel darned his socks, her needle flashing in the firelight. Outside, the wind whispered through snow-laden pines, and inside, the pot of stew bubbled softly on the stove. "Would you like to hear another hymn?" Isabel asked, not looking up from her work. She'd taken to singing in the evenings, her clear voice filling the cabin with warmth. Matthew nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Always do." Isabel drew breath to begin, but suddenly froze. In the distance, the sharp sound of approaching hoofbeats cut through the peaceful evening. Matthew stood quickly, his face tightening with concern. "Stay inside," he ordered, moving to the door. But before he could reach it, it burst open with a bang that made Isabel jump. Deputy Boone strode in, snow swirling around his boots. Behind him loomed two men Matthew had never seen, one tall and lean with cold eyes, the other shorter, but heavily muscled. Both wore expensive town clothes that seemed out of place in the mountain cabin. "Evening, Brant," the deputy drawled. "These gentlemen would like a word." The tall man stepped forward, removing his hat with exaggerated politeness. "Name's Pike. This here's Mr. Dugan." He gestured to his companion. "We represent certain business interests in town, and it seems you're in possession of something that rightfully belongs to us." Isabel shrank back against the wall, her face pale. Matthew moved to stand between her and the men, his hands clenched at his sides. "Isabel belongs to no one," he said firmly. "I bought her fair and square." Pike's polite smile didn't reach his eyes. "Now that's where you're wrong, friend. See, we had a prior arrangement with her father. Paid him a tidy sum too before you interfered with our property." "I ain't your property." Isabel's voice shook but held steady. "And I won't go with you." "Shut your mouth, girl," Dugan growled, taking a threatening step forward. Matthew's arm shot out, blocking his path. "Get out of my house," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "All of you." The deputy sighed theatrically. "Can't do that, Brant. These men have legal claim. Got the papers right here." He pulled a document from his coat. "Now we can do this peaceful-like, or we can do it hard." "There ain't nothing legal about selling human beings," Matthew protested. "I won't let you take her." Pike's smile vanished. "Dugan." The muscled man moved with surprising speed. His fist caught Matthew in the jaw, sending him staggering. Before Matthew could recover, Dugan landed another blow to his ribs. "No!" Isabel screamed. "Leave him alone." She tried to run to Matthew, but Pike seized her arm in an iron grip. The deputy moved in too, grabbing her other arm as she struggled. Matthew pushed himself up, blood trickling from his split lip. He lunged at Pike, but Dugan was ready. A brutal punch doubled Matthew over, followed by a knee to his face that sent him crashing into the table. "Stop it, please." Isabel's voice cracked with terror as Pike and the deputy dragged her toward the door. She fought like a wild thing, kicking and twisting, but their grip was too strong. Matthew tried to rise again, his vision blurring. Dugan's boot caught him in the ribs, driving the air from his lungs. The big man laughed, landing another kick that left Matthew gasping in the snow that was blowing in through the open door. "Ain't so tough now, are you?" Dugan sneered. "What kind of man pays good silver for a woman and don't even touch her? Wasted your dollar, friend." Outside, Isabel's screams echoed through the trees as the men forced her onto a horse. Matthew crawled toward the door, leaving a trail of blood in the snow, but another kick sent him sprawling. "Matthew," Isabel's cry pierced his heart. "Matthew, help me." "Should have stayed in your mountains, virgin," Pike called from outside. "Some things ain't meant for men like you." Dugan delivered one final kick before following his companions out. The sound of hoofbeats faded into the gathering dark, carrying Isabel's screams with them. Only the wind remained, driving snow through the open door to collect on Matthew's broken form. He lay there, tasting blood and bitter failure. The cabin felt suddenly vast and empty, mocking him with memories of Isabel's presence. Her half-finished darning still on the chair, the stew now burning on the stove, the lingering echo of the hymn she never got to sing. Despair washed over him in waves as black as the gathering night. He had promised to protect her, to give her a safe home, and he had failed. The warmth and hope that had grown between them lay shattered like the overturned table, leaving only cold emptiness behind. The wind moaned through the pines, carrying away the last sounds of the riders. Matthew remained motionless in the snow, his tears freezing on his bloodied face as darkness claimed the mountain. Matthew lay in the snow, his body aching from every blow. The bitter wind cut through his clothes, but the cold inside his heart felt sharper. With tremendous effort, he pulled himself to his knees, each movement sending waves of pain through his bruised ribs. Blood dripped steadily from his split lip, staining the pristine snow crimson. The cabin door still hung open, creaking on its hinges as the wind pushed it back and forth. Inside, the fire flickered weakly, casting dancing shadows on the walls that now felt too empty, too quiet. Matthew grabbed the doorframe and hauled himself upright, stumbling into the warmth of his home that no longer felt like home. The room bore witness to the violence. The table lay overturned. Isabel's darnings scattered across the floor. The stew pot tipped and spilling across the hearthstones. But it was the empty chair where she had sat, preparing to sing her evening hymn that broke something deep inside him. His legs gave out and he collapsed beside the hearth, his breathing ragged. As he slumped forward, his hand landed on something soft, his mother's old Bible, knocked from its shelf in the struggle. It had fallen open, its pages splayed against the floorboards. Drops of blood from his face spattered onto the weathered pages. Matthew stared at the blood-stained scripture, remembering how Isabel had found his mother's letters, how she had understood his loneliness because it matched her own. He thought of the trust that had grown between them, as natural as spring following winter. Trust he had failed to protect. "Lord," he whispered, his voice trembling in the empty cabin. The word felt strange on his lips. He hadn't truly prayed since his mother's passing, but Isabel's screams still echoed in his ears, and he knew he could not face this darkness alone. "Lord," he tried again, stronger this time. "I ain't been much for talking to you these past years. Reckon I thought I could make my own way." His fingers traced the blood-spotted page. "But that girl, she brought your light back into this place, made me remember what it was to have faith in something bigger than myself." Tears mixed with the blood now falling onto the Bible's thin pages. "I failed her, Lord. Failed to keep her safe like I promised." His voice cracked. "But if you're listening, if you're still willing to hear a broken man's prayer, make me worthy of her trust. Show me how to fight rightly. Not with fists, I learned tonight that ain't my strength, but show me your way to set things right." The fire popped and sparked, sending embers dancing up the chimney. Matthew remained kneeling, letting the words pour out like water from a spring long buried under stone. He prayed until his voice grew hoarse, until the fire burned low and the wind's howl softened to a whisper. Sleep eluded him that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Isabel being dragged away, heard her cries carrying through the snowy forest. He lay on his bunk, staring at the ceiling, remembering how she had teased him gently about his shyness, how her laugh had filled the cabin with warmth he had never known he was missing. As false dawn began to pale the eastern sky, Matthew rose. His body protested every movement, but his mind was clear, his purpose set. He moved with deliberate care, packing supplies into his saddlebags, dried meat, hard bread, an extra blanket. He strapped on his old revolver, more out of habit than any plan for violence. The Bible, he tucked carefully into his coat pocket, close to his heart. The mule snorted and stamped as Matthew entered the barn, breath steaming in the pre-dawn chill. "Sorry, old friend," he murmured, saddling the animal with stiff fingers. "Got a long ride ahead of us." The sun was just cresting the mountains when Matthew swung into the saddle, trying to ignore how his ribs screamed in protest. The snow had stopped falling, leaving the world draped in pristine white that seemed to mock the darkness of his purpose. He turned the mule's head toward town, knowing the journey would take the better part of the day, even in good weather. The trail wound treacherously down the mountainside, ice lurking beneath the fresh snow. Matthew let the mule pick its way carefully, using the slow pace to plan his approach. He had no illusions about his chances in another physical confrontation with Dugan. But his mother had always told him that right and wrong were clearer in God's light than in man's shadow. There had to be a way to fight this battle with truth rather than fists. The sun climbed higher as they descended, but brought little warmth. The cold seemed to have settled into Matthew's very bones, yet he barely noticed. His mind was filled with Isabel. Her kind eyes, her quiet strength, the way she had refused to let her father's cruelty break her spirit. She had survived so much already. He would not let her light be extinguished in some brothel backroom. Hour after hour passed as Matthew and his mule made their way down the mountain. The forest gradually thinned, giving way to scattered homesteads and, finally, the outskirts of town. It was well past noon when they clattered onto the main street, both man and beast covered in snow and ice. Matthew's jaw was set firm despite his split lip and bruised face. His eyes, clear and determined, scanned the busy street. Townsfolk stopped to stare at his battered appearance, but he paid them no mind. He'd come seeking not their judgment but God's justice, and this time he would not fail Isabel's trust. He guided his mule toward the hitching post outside the sheriff's office, each hoofbeat bringing him closer to whatever battle lay ahead. The weapon he carried was not the gun at his hip, but the truth in his heart, and the Bible in his pocket. And for the first time in years, he felt the steady presence of his mother's God walking beside him. The winter sun hung low in the western sky as Matthew dismounted, his muscles stiff from the cold and the long ride. But his spirit was stronger than it had been since Isabel's screams had shattered his peaceful evening. He had found his path forward, not through violence but through faith and righteous action. The sheriff's office door stood before him, a simple wooden barrier between despair and hope. Matthew straightened his shoulders, touched the Bible in his pocket, and reached for the handle. He had promised Isabel she would not be harmed under his care. With God's help, he would keep that promise or die trying. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the muddy street as Matthew tied his mule behind the livery stable. His body ached from the long ride, but his mind stayed sharp, focused on finding Isabel. He moved carefully through the quieter alleys of town, keeping his head low to avoid drawing attention. The brothel's boarding house stood 3 stories tall on the edge of town, its weathered, clapboard walls painted a garish red. Matthew's heart clenched as he studied the building from the shelter of an alley. Lace curtains hung in most windows, but one on the second floor remained bare. As he watched, a familiar figure appeared, Isabel, her face pale as milk against the darkening sky. Their eyes met across the distance. She pressed her hand to the glass before someone pulled her away. Matthew's fingers curled into fists, but he remembered his prayer. Violence would not save her. He needed help, the kind that came from wisdom and the law, not brute force. There was only one person in town he trusted to understand, Mrs. Abigail Turner, the preacher's widow. He found her at the church organizing hymnals in the empty pews. She looked up as his shadow fell across the floor, her eyes widening at his bruised face. "Mrs. Turner," Matthew said, removing his hat. "I need your help. It's about Isabel." Abigail set down her books and gestured for him to sit. "Tell me everything, Mr. Brandt." Matthew spoke quietly, relating the whole story, how he had bought Isabel to save her, how they had found unexpected friendship in his cabin, and how the brothel men had torn her away. His voice grew thick with emotion as he described her screams. "They claim her father had the right to sell her," he finished, "but ma'am, it ain't right. She's a person, not property." Abigail's face had grown grave as she listened. Now she nodded slowly, her eyes distant with thought. "No, it's not right. And I believe there may be more to this story than even Isabel knows." She stood suddenly. "Wait here." She disappeared into the church office, returning minutes later with a leather-bound ledger. "Before I married the preacher, I taught at the county orphanage," she explained, laying the book on a pew. "I kept records of every child who passed through those doors." Her finger traced down columns of neat script until she stopped with a sharp intake of breath. "Here, Isabel Carter, age 4, brought to the orphanage after her mother's death. Her father," Abigail's voice hardened. Her father signed away all parental rights. He had no legal claim to sell her to anyone. Matthew leaned forward, hope rising in his chest. You mean? I mean the sale was illegal from the start. The brothel men have no rightful claim on her. Abigail closed the ledger with purpose. We'll need to get these records to the judge, but first, we must ensure Isabel's safety. They won't let me near that boarding house, Matthew said bitterly. No, but they can't stop me from paying a charitable visit to girls in need. Abigail's eyes sparked with determination. Let me gather some supplies. Food, warm shawls, things a Christian woman might naturally bring to those less fortunate. I can check on Isabel, let her know help is coming. Thank you, Matthew whispered. I don't know how to repay such kindness. By continuing to be the good man you've shown yourself to be. Abigail touched his shoulder gently. You can sleep in our barn tonight. Tomorrow we'll see justice done. As darkness fell, Matthew settled into clean straw in the preacher's barn. The widow brought him soup and cornbread, along with news that lifted his spirits. Isabel is unharmed, she reported. They've got her locked away with 3 other girls, all of them terrified but holding on to hope. She asked me to tell you she's sorry she brought trouble to your door. Matthew shook his head. She brought nothing but light. That's what I told her you'd say. Abigail smiled. She's been singing hymns to comfort the younger girls. Even in captivity, that child radiates grace. After Abigail left, Matthew pulled out his mother's Bible. The pages still bore spots of his dried blood, reminding him of his desperate prayer by the hearth. Now he prayed again, not in despair, but in quiet determination. In the boarding house across town, Isabel sat on a narrow bed, her arms around a trembling girl no more than 15. The room was cold, but she had wrapped both of them in the shawl Mrs. Turner had brought. 2 other girls huddled nearby, drawing comfort from Isabel's soft singing. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound, she sang, her voice barely above a whisper. That saved a wretch like me. The familiar words filled the darkness with hope, just as they had in Matthew's cabin. She thought of him now, his gentle awkwardness, his steadfast kindness. She had seen him in the alley that afternoon, his face bruised but his eyes burning with purpose. She knew he would come for her, not with violence, but with something stronger. Until then, she would be strong for these scared young souls beside her. I once was lost, but now am found, she continued singing. Was blind, but now I see. One by one, the other girls joined in, their voices gaining courage together. The hymn rose softly through the floorboards of the boarding house, a quiet defiance against those who would treat them as less than human. In the barn, Matthew heard a distant strain of singing on the wind. He recognized Isabel's voice, carrying across town like a beacon of faith. Laying back in the straw, he added his own rough whisper to the hymn, a promise carried on the night air. Through many dangers, toils, and snares, I have already come. Tomorrow would bring its own battles, but tonight faith and song connected those separated by walls and darkness. Matthew touched the Bible against his heart, remembering Isabel's words about trusting in something bigger than their fears. Together they would face whatever morning brought, armed with truth, justice, and the strength that comes from knowing you fight for what is right. The night deepened around the sleeping town. In the boarding house, Isabel finally drifted off, still holding the young girl close. In the barn, Matthew slept too, his dreams full of hymns and hope. And in her small house by the church, Abigail Turner prepared what they would need for the morning's confrontation, laying out papers and prayers like weapons of light against the darkness. Dawn broke over the mountain town in ribbons of pale gold and pink. Fresh snow from the night before blanketed the muddy streets, muffling the early morning sounds of merchants setting up their stalls. Matthew stood at the edge of the town square, his breath forming clouds in the crisp air. He had traded his usual buckskins for his one good shirt, though it hung loose on his frame after days of worry. The town was just beginning to stir. A few curious onlookers paused their morning routines as Matthew strode purposefully toward the center of the square. His boots crunched in the fresh snow, each step measured and deliberate. Behind him, Mrs. Abigail Turner walked with quiet dignity, the leather-bound orphanage ledger clutched to her chest. Matthew stopped beneath the bare branches of the town's central oak tree. His voice, usually soft and hesitant, rang out clear and strong across the square. "I call for a public hearing. Let all honest folk witness truth this day." His words echoed off the wooden storefronts. More townspeople emerged from shops and homes, drawn by the unexpected commotion. Near the sheriff's office, Deputy Harlan Boone lounged against a hitching post, a sneer curling his thin lips. "Ain't you caused enough trouble, mountain man?" Boone drawled, but Matthew stood his ground. "The law grants any citizen the right to speak their piece," Abigail Turner called out, her voice carrying surprising authority. "Or does that right not apply when inconvenient truths might be revealed?" The deputy's face darkened, but he could hardly argue with the preacher's widow in front of gathering witnesses. More townspeople were arriving now, forming a loose circle around Matthew. Among them, Matthew spotted Mr. Pike and Mr. Dugan, the brothel syndicate men, watching with cold eyes from the shadows of the general store's porch. "Speak your piece, then," Boone said finally, pushing off from the hitching post. "Though I don't reckon it'll change anything." Matthew drew himself up to his full height, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "3 weeks ago, I bought a young woman's freedom for $1 silver, not as property to own, but as a soul to protect from those who would do her harm." Whispers rippled through the crowd. Everyone remembered that bitter afternoon when Isabel had stood on the auction block, her face hidden beneath a burlap sack. "I took her to my cabin," Matthew continued, "gave her shelter, safety, and respect. In return, she brought light and grace to a lonely home. We broke bread together, attended church together, worked side by side as equals before God." He turned slowly, meeting the eyes of those gathered. "Then these men," he gestured toward Pike and Dugan, "came with false claims and took her by force. They beat me down and dragged her away, claiming she was property promised to their business." The word business hung heavy in the morning air. Even those who frequented the brothel shifted uncomfortably at the naked truth of it. "The law supports their claim," Deputy Boone interrupted. "The girl's father had no right to sell her at all." Abigail Turner stepped forward, opening the leather ledger. "I have here the county orphanage records. Isabel Carter was surrendered to the orphanage at age 4 after her mother's death. Her father, John Carter, signed away all parental rights. The document bears his mark, witnessed by 3 town officials." She held up the ledger, its pages clearly showing the signatures and official seal. Any subsequent attempt to sell her was illegal from the start. The brothel syndicate's claim is built on fraud, aided by those sworn to uphold the law. Her gaze fixed pointedly on Deputy Boone, whose face had gone pale. Murmurs grew louder among the townspeople as the truth sank in. "Bring her out," Matthew demanded, his voice carrying across the square. "Let Isabel speak for herself." For a long moment, no one moved. Then Pike nodded curtly to Dugan, who disappeared into the boarding house. Minutes later, he emerged with Isabel between him and another man, their fingers digging into her arms. Matthew's heart clenched at the sight of her. She wore the same dress she'd had on when they took her, now wrinkled and stained. But her head was held high, her eyes clear and unafraid. Despite their rough handling, she walked with dignity, refusing to be dragged or hurried. When she saw Matthew standing tall in the square, her eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them back. The crowd parted as Dugan marched her forward. "Tell them, girl," Pike called out with false sweetness. "Tell them how your father promised you to our establishment, how this mountain man stole you away." Isabel looked around at the gathered faces, some sympathetic, some suspicious, some merely curious. Her voice, when it came, was steady and clear as a bell. "My father abandoned me to the orphanage when I was 4 years old. I remember signing my name in Mrs. Turner's ledger when I learned to write. I remember the day my father returned years later, drunk and desperate for money." She paused, gathering strength. "He had no right to sell what was not his. And these men knew it, yet they offered him money for me anyway." The townsfolk stirred restlessly. Many had known John Carter as a drunkard and a fool, but this calculated cruelty struck deeper. "Mr. Brandt bought me, yes," Isabel continued, her voice warming as she looked at Matthew. "But he never treated me as property. He gave me a safe home, honest work, and the freedom to choose my own path. He brought me to church instead of hiding me away. He showed me what a good man's heart looks like." Matthew felt heat rise in his cheeks, but he kept his eyes steady on Isabel. She stood straighter now, shrugging off Dugan's grip. "I choose to stand here now," she declared. "I choose to speak truth. And I choose Matthew Brandt, who treated me as a daughter of God rather than a thing to be bought and sold." The square had gone silent as a chapel. Even the winter wind seemed to hold its breath. Deputy Boone shifted uneasily, while Pike and Dugan exchanged worried glances. A woman's voice broke the silence. "Shame on you all." Mother Barnes, the baker's wife, stepped forward. "We've watched this evil trade grow in our town, telling ourselves it wasn't our business. But that stops today." Others began to speak up, the blacksmith's wife, the schoolteacher, the wagon maker. One by one, they moved to stand with Matthew and Isabel. Mrs. Turner held the ledger high like a shield of truth. "Deputy," the blacksmith rumbled, "seems to me you've been enforcing the wrong kind of law." Boone looked around at the shifting mood of the crowd. His hand twitched toward his gun, but too many eyes watched him now. Too many witnesses to the truth. Pike tried one last gambit. "We have papers." "Papers built on lies," Abigail Turner cut in. "Papers that won't stand against official orphanage records. Papers that certain law officers might regret putting their names to once the circuit judge reviews them." The deputy's face went from pale to gray. He knew as well as anyone that the circuit judge was due in town within the week. This many witnesses, combined with Mrs. Turner's evidence, would be impossible to dismiss. "The girl's free to go where she pleases," he said finally, his voice bitter with defeat. "But don't think this changes anything else in town." "It changes everything," Isabel said quietly. She walked forward to stand beside Matthew, her head still high. "Because now everyone knows that truth and courage can overcome greed and cruelty, that God's law stands above man's corrupt dealings." The morning sun had risen fully now, making the fresh snow gleam. Matthew felt its warmth on his face as he looked down at Isabel. She smiled up at him, tired but triumphant, no longer afraid to be seen. The crowd began to disperse, but not before many came forward to shake Matthew's hand or offer Isabel a kind word. Mother Barnes insisted on wrapping her in a warm shawl. The blacksmith's wife pressed a loaf of fresh bread into her hands. Pike and Dugan slunk away toward the saloon, their power broken in the clear light of day. Deputy Boone retreated to his office, already composing excuses for the circuit judge. "Ready to go home?" Matthew asked softly when the last well-wishers had gone. Isabel's eyes shone as she took his offered arm. "Yes," she said, "home." Pike's face twisted with rage. "This ain't over." He lunged forward, reaching for Isabel. "We paid good money." "Stand back." Matthew stepped between them, his broad shoulders forming a wall of protection. But before Pike could strike, 3 townsmen moved to flank Matthew: the blacksmith, the wagon maker, and old Ben from the general store. "You heard the evidence," the blacksmith said, his heavy hammer still hanging from his belt. "The girl was never for sale. Not then, not now." Dugan's meaty hand slipped toward his gun, but he froze when he saw how many eyes watched him. Women who usually hurried past the brothel now stood their ground, arms crossed, faces set with righteous anger. Men who might have once laughed at crude jokes now positioned themselves protectively near their wives and daughters. "The Lord sees all." Abigail Turner's voice rang out clear and strong across the square. She still held the ledger, but now she raised her other hand toward heaven. "He sees how you've profited from the suffering of young women. He sees how you've twisted the law to serve greed instead of justice." Her eyes found Deputy Boone, who shifted uncomfortably. "He sees those who took bribes to look the other way while girls were traded like cattle." The deputy's face flushed red. "Now see here, Mrs. Turner." "No, you see here." She strode forward, her skirts swishing against the packed earth. "I've watched too long in silence. We all have. Girls disappearing from the orphanage, their records mysteriously lost. Fathers paid to sign away daughters' deputies who somehow never noticed the wagons arriving at night." She turned slowly, meeting the eyes of the gathered crowd. "We've all been complicit in our silence. But today we speak truth." A murmur of agreement rippled through the townspeople. Mother Barnes stepped forward, her usually gentle face hard with determination. "My own sister was lost to men like you," she said to Pike. Promised a job as a housekeeper in Carson City. We never saw her again. More voices joined in, years of suppressed stories spilling out like water through a broken dam. A laundress spoke of her cousin, the farrier of his niece, each tale drawing nods of recognition from the crowd. Pike spat on the ground. Ain't our fault if girls choose our line of work. Choose? Isabel's voice cut through the noise like a blade. She moved to stand beside Matthew, her back straight as a pine tree. Like I chose to be sold? Like those other girls chose to be trapped by false debts and threats? The morning sun caught her face, showing every eye the quiet dignity there. No longer was she the heavy-set girl hidden under a burlap sack. She stood revealed as a woman of strength and grace, unashamed before God and man. I will not be hidden again, she declared, her voice carrying to every corner of the square. Not by a sack, not by shame, not by the lies you use to keep girls silent. God made me in His image, and I stand here today as His daughter, not your property. Matthew's heart swelled with pride as he watched her. Carefully, reverently, he took her hand in his. Isabel, he said, his deep voice gentle but firm enough to carry. I took you from that auction block not as a purchase, but as a soul worth saving. These weeks together have shown me your true worth, your kindness, your strength, your faith. He turned to face her fully. If you're willing, I'd have you as my partner in all things, bound by love and respect, not by sale or law. Isabel's eyes shone with tears, but her smile was radiant. I choose freely, she said. I choose you. A hush fell over the square. Those who had once jeered at the auction now looked away, shame coloring their faces. The deputy tugged at his collar, uncomfortable under the weight of public scrutiny. This is all very touching, Pike sneered, but we still have papers. Papers built on fraud, Abigail interrupted. Papers that won't stand against the orphanage records. Papers that certain officials might regret signing once the circuit judge arrives next week. She fixed Deputy Boone with a stern look. Isn't that right, Deputy? Boone's face had gone ashen. He knew the circuit judge well, a stern man with no patience for corruption. One look at the evidence, one hearing of these testimonies, and his comfortable arrangement with the brothel syndicate would crumble. He coughed, trying to recover his authority. Given the new evidence presented, it seems there may have been some irregularities in the documentation. He backed away from Pike and Dugan, already distancing himself from their schemes. The girl appears to be free to choose her own path. This is horse shit, Dugan growled. We ain't leaving empty-handed. Yes, you are. The blacksmith stepped forward, joined by more townsmen. You're leaving now, while you still can walk. Pike's hand twitched toward his gun, but the odds were clear. Not just the men stood against them now, but the entire town. Mothers, daughters, wives, all with eyes that had finally opened to the evil they'd tolerated too long. This ain't over, Pike snarled, backing away. You'll regret crossing us? No, Isabel said calmly. You'll regret thinking you could own a person's soul. The brothel men retreated, cursing under their breath. Deputy Boone slunk toward his office, already composing explanations for the circuit judge. The crowd watched until they disappeared, making sure they truly left. One by one, people came forward to shake Matthew's hand or offer Isabel a kind word. Mother Barnes wrapped her in a warm embrace, whispering prayers of blessing. The blacksmith's wife pressed a loaf of fresh bread into her hands, while others offered small gifts, a warm shawl, a jar of preserves, a handful of late winter apples. You've done a brave thing, Abigail said, clasping Isabel's hand. Not just for yourself, but for every girl who might have followed that dark path. Isabel squeezed the older woman's fingers. Thank you for bringing the truth to light. Truth was there all along, Abigail smiled. It just needed voices brave enough to speak it. The morning sun had risen high now, making the fresh snow gleam like diamond dust. Matthew stood tall beside Isabel, no longer the awkward mountain man afraid to meet people's eyes. Together, they had faced down evil with quiet strength and unwavering faith. The crowd began to disperse, heading back to their daily tasks. But something had shifted in the town's spirit. Women walked with straighter backs, men spoke in more measured tones, and all seemed to feel the weight of their shared responsibility to protect the vulnerable. Matthew turned to Isabel, his eyes soft with devotion. "Ready to go home?" She smiled up at him, tired but triumphant, no longer afraid to be seen. "Yes," she said, taking his offered arm. "Home." The word rang with promise, not just of shelter and warmth, but of love freely given and dignity finally restored. Together they walked through the square, heading toward the mountain trails that would lead them back to their cabin, back to the life they had chosen to build together. Behind them, the town stirred with new purpose. Abigail Turner gathered several women to discuss changes needed at the orphanage. The blacksmith and his friends spoke of keeping watch against future attempts to revive the brothel trade. Seeds of justice planted in the winter soil of awakened conscience waited for spring's thaw to bloom. The evening air held a gentle chill as Matthew and Isabel made their way to the preacher's widow's home. Lamplight glowed warm through the windows, and Abigail Turner stood waiting at the door, her weathered face creased in a welcoming smile. Come in," she beckoned, ushering them into the cozy kitchen where a pot of stew bubbled on the stove. "You both must be exhausted after such a day." Over bowls of steaming stew and fresh cornbread, they spoke of practical matters. "Isabel can stay here with me until spring," Abigail offered. "It would be proper, and give you time to prepare, Matthew." Matthew nodded, his deep voice earnest. "I will build a second room onto the cabin. Make it right and proper, with a real bedroom for Isabel." Isabel's eyes grew misty. "I have prayed every night for a true home," she confessed softly. "Not just walls and a roof, but a place where love dwells." They talked long into the evening about their hopes. Matthew spoke of teaching Isabel to tend a garden come spring. Isabel shared her dream of filling their home with hymns and prayer. Even the painful subject of her father arose, with Isabel whispering her struggle to forgive. Before retiring, Matthew knelt beside his chair. For the first time in years, prayer came easily to his lips. "Lord, thank you for bringing Isabel back. Guide us as we build our life together." Isabel knelt beside him, her hand coming to rest near his on the chair seat. Their fingers touched as they prayed, a gesture as sacred as any wedding vow. Spring crept into the mountain valley like a gentle awakening. The last patches of snow melted away, revealing tender green shoots pushing through dark earth. At Matthew's cabin, the sound of hammering echoed through the pines as he and 3 neighbors raised walls for Isabel's new room. "Much obliged for the help," Matthew said quietly as they fitted the last window frame. The men nodded, accepting his thanks with frontier simplicity. Their presence spoke volumes about how the town's heart had shifted. Near the cabin door, Isabel knelt in the fresh-turned soil, tucking herb seedlings into neat rows. Her voice lifted in hymns that floated across the clearing, making the men smile as they worked. Mint and sage would grace their table come summer. In town, Abigail Turner's parlor became a workshop of joy as she helped Isabel stitch her wedding dress. The simple white cotton took shape under their careful hands. "You'll be beautiful," Abigail assured her, smoothing the fabric. One afternoon, Matthew led Isabel to the creek where they had walked in winter. Now the banks bloomed with purple lupine and golden balsam root. Isabel's eyes filled with tears as she remembered his promise months ago. "You said you'd show me wildflowers when spring came," she whispered. Matthew smiled, touching a delicate blossom. "God's promise, like mine, proves true in its season." Word spread through the valley about their upcoming wedding. Though some still whispered doubts, most townsfolk had witnessed their steadfast devotion. Matthew spent evenings cutting fresh pine boughs to decorate the creekside clearing, where they would say their vows. The wedding day arrived with golden sunshine spilling across the mountain valley. Townsfolk gathered by the creek, where Matthew had laid fresh pine boughs in a natural chapel beneath towering evergreens. Birdsong filled the morning air, like nature's own wedding bells. Isabel emerged from behind the trees, radiant in her simple white cotton dress. Her bare feet whispered across the soft carpet of pine needles as she walked toward Matthew. He stood waiting in his freshly brushed Sunday coat, his eyes glistening with emotion. As Isabel reached him, Matthew's large hand trembled as he took hers. The preacher spoke words of blessing while chickadees trilled overhead. When they exchanged vows, Isabel's voice rang clear and strong. Where once I knew shame, now I have found honor and love. Matthew promised protection and devotion until death. Their kiss as husband and wife sent joyful hymns echoing off the mountainsides. That evening in their cabin, lamplight warmed Isabel's new room. Together, they watched the burlap sack, her old prison, turn to ash in the hearth. Kneeling side by side, they gave humble thanks for love's redemption. Thank you for listening. Stories connect us in the most unexpected ways. If you felt that spark today, make sure you're subscribed. I share a new one daily, and the next might change your day.